It's Sunday, August 12th, 2018, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today we're joined by one of our mentors, Chris Butler, Director of AI at Philosophy Group, and he's going to be leading a talk on adversarial models in product. Let me just briefly explain the format for those of you who might be joining us for the first time today. Chris is a mentor in the Product Mentor program. The Product Mentor is a program that helps pair up mentors and mentees from all around the world. We're in over 20 different countries at various different times. We've been going on for over 5 years. What we have in the room are mentors and mentees from the current session of the Product Mentor. We also open it up to everybody, so always feel free to keep posting your questions throughout the talk so that we can then pass them on to Chris in fairly real time. So let's just we'll just go quickly around the room with introductions. I'll tell everyone a little bit more. And then we'll get started. Let me start with the person closest to me, and that is Matthew. Matthew, tell us a little bit about yourself. Are you a mentor or a mentee, and where are you?
Sure. So I'm a mentee in the Product Mentor program in the suburbs of New York right now, and I'm matched up with Sud Kaushik. And I'm working on hotel property management software.
Excellent. And let's go to Joni.
Hi, everybody. This is Joni Hoadley. I'm based in Santa Barbara, although I'm currently in Mammoth, California on vacation. I'm a software product management consultant and coach, and I have spent the last 20 years working for companies that are kind of at the intersection of music and technology. And I am a mentor, and I'm working with Marzia. Excellent.
And let's go to Hannah.
Hey everyone, my name is Hannah and I work in financial services. I'm in New York City and my mentor is Patrick Hoffman.
Excellent. And to Chris.
Yeah, I'm Chris Butler, Director of AI at Philosophy, which is a design consultancy firm. And I do a lot of design research and prototyping. My background is a bunch of different product places. Yeah, I'm a mentor for Alan and Daphne this season.
Excellent. Andrew.
I'm Andrew Chu, been a product manager for about 7 years, based in New York now. I've worked on B2B and B2C kind of fintech projects. And right now I'm a product manager at Vega Factor, focused on helping other organizations build higher performing cultures.
And over to Alan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alin, located in Cluj-Napoca, Romania. Currently, product manager working at Modus Create company, and my mentor is Chris. Thanks for that, and happy to be here.
Excellent. And I am Jeremy Horn, aka the Product Guy. I'll be moderating here today for you. So for those of you who are joining us either through YouTube or if you also can go over to theproductmentor.com/live. And if there's video on the top, if you scroll down, you'll see a chat box, and you can always post in questions and comments. Things that are topically related, I'll get to Chris in fairly real time. I usually wait for a good moment to interrupt him. But things that are more generic, what is product management? Why are we all here? Those types of questions I will still hand off to Chris, but I will wait with the more generic ones until the end of the talk. But with all of that said, I think it's time for us to start the talk. We'll let Chris take it away on adversarial models in product. Chris, over to you.
Great. Thank you. So yeah, like I said, I'm Chris Butler, and I'm going to be talking about adversarial product management. And you may be asking, what is adversarial product management? I'll get into that in a moment. But before I do, and by the way, all of the resources are available at this particular link, and I'll have that again at the end of the talk. So I'm Chris Butler, Director of AI. I've been a mentor with the Product Mentor for 5 seasons now, and I have over 18 years of product and business development experience. And I definitely think that product and BD, there's a lot of overlap. I think my first mentor talk was actually about the similarities between those two roles, but I really think they're kindred spirits, so you should check that out. I've been at places like Microsoft, Waze, Kayak. I started my own company that was in the restaurant management space, and have worked a lot of other places as well. But right now, working mostly as a design consultant, helping both large and small companies figure out really early stage stuff. This is my email address and my Twitter handle if you want to say nice things about me on the internet. But let's first start with really quickly that philosophy, as I was saying, we help really small companies and very large companies start to experiment and understand maybe the problem space. And we do a lot of that through prototyping, research. And one of the things, we actually have a list of values that all philosophers believe. And they're, oddly enough, called the Philosopher's Stones. And the fifth one that I want to talk about really briefly is make it better, which is about this idea of constant incrementalism towards something better that you're doing. It could be the processes that you're using. It could be the actual work that you're outputting. It could be a product that you're building. And the reason why I think this is really related to adversarial is that a lot of the issues that we have today, I think, as product people and as product teams are really about biases. And these biases, there's a lot of different ones. There's actually a whole list on Wikipedia that you can check out. But these biases actually keep us constrained in ways that are maybe not ideal. So like naive realism means that we believe everybody else thinks the way that we do. Attentional bias is that whatever we're focused on the most is what we actually believe to be best most of the time. Confirmation bias, availability heuristic. The worst one is probably bias blind spots, which is that we're blind to our actual biases. And all of these things, while constraints can be good in some ways when it comes to creative work, they actually hurt us in other ways. And so this talk is really meant to talk about 3 ways that I've found to remove constraints that are all related to adversarial thinking. And the first one is red teaming. The second one is feedback loops. And then the last one is randomness. And so all these things are meant to, in some way, go against these biases or these constraint sets or worldviews that we have as product people. And I'll also talk about particular examples and how you can use this on a day-to-day basis for your product management. So red teaming. If people are not familiar with red teaming, it really started back, I think the first time that red team was used as a term was back in the 1960s. And this was to describe the blue team versus the red team, which was the US versus Russia, or the USSR. And what red teaming really is, when we talk about it from a military standpoint, is this idea of some type of, in this case, this is the Marine Corps Op 4, which is the oppositional force. And they basically play the bad guys. So there's a team that exists in a bunch of different military, US militaries as well as worldwide militaries, that learn about and practice what their adversaries do. And so probably, a very famous example of this is during Top Gun, when they're at the training facility and they're being attacked by someone that is pretending to be basically a Russian MiG that's played by one of the instructors. And so this is an example of what would be called an oppositional force. So this is something that is done militarily all the time. We tend to do a little bit less of this, I think, when we're working on product. And so there's a couple online resources around red teaming. And in particular, Red Team Journal is talking about red teaming from the standpoint of what we would coin as cybersecurity or InfoSec. But basically, the practice of viewing a problem from an adversary's or a competitor's perspective is really what red teaming is. There's some other constraints as well that I would put on red teaming in the sense that it should be a separate team. Generally, they are not given rules to abide by, right? So they're supposed to act like an adversary actually would. And the biggest issue around this is that it attacks our assumptions about the world, right? So we have a bunch of assumptions or worldviews or mindsets that we're constantly using. And these could be just assumptions though, right? Like when we talk about the OODA loop from John Boyd, observe, orient, decide, act, one of the most important steps there is really around orientation in how your understanding the world is different from the way the world actually is. And the redteams.net, which is basically a red team consultancy, they have a list of rules, and one of the ones that I like the most is really assumption is the mother of all F-ups. And so anytime that you do make a lot of assumptions and you're not checking them constantly, you will build things that people don't care about. So when we talk about product red teaming, what's most interesting to me, I've written about kind of competitive analysis before, and I think a lot of competitive analysis falls flat because it's thinking about it from the standpoint of what features are there that I have versus what my competitor has. But one of the most important aspects, especially from that redteam.net group, was really around recon. And so this idea of recon is, how do you learn about the way that your adversaries or your competitors actually think, the way that they practice, why they do things, what types of processes do they use, what types of tools do they use? And what Red Team refers to this as is really open source intelligence. And so if you go on Medium and you look for people that work for this company, there's probably lots of them today that are in product that are writing Medium articles. And so this is just an example of that. Say I was working for Lyft, I would look up things about Uber. And if I was working at Uber, I'd look up things about Lyft. And so everything that people are talking about really ends up being the things that they care about. They'll talk about processes that they use on a regular basis. This is true about Twitter. This is true about even Facebook or LinkedIn. So that idea of like really understanding how your adversaries would think in the first place is really important. The next thing is what we'll call role-playing or wargaming or scenario play. And so this is essentially where once you understand how your adversary may act, you can then set up certain situations where you would pretend to be your adversary and take action. And so generally, when it comes to red teaming, this means that you're trying to basically compromise and extract data from, say, a data server, but doing that using all types of things, including not only just like tech, but also social engineering, physical engineering, etc. I use this picture as an example of role-playing because it's such a great video, and I'll link to it in my notes, but it's such a great video of this guy is pretending to be a customer for a website, and the woman is basically just reading what the web form is. And so when you look at the web form, you would say, this isn't a great web form, but it's a web form that may work for this particular circumstance. But when you actually get into a role-play scenario, you feel how hostile that web form actually is. So this idea of kind of creating scenarios that you role play where someone is meant to be your competitor, or even how your customer may act is really powerful. The next thing is what's referred to as dominant logic. And so this is a link to a management journal, but there's some good HBR articles that talk about this as well. And at Philosophy, we formed this into kind of an exercise to understand dominant logic. But really what dominant logic is that, again, those assumptions that you have about the way the world works, you list them out, and then you purposely take what would be the realistic opposite of them. And so if you believe that, say as Lyft, that the people will not want to jump on electric scooters, you would have to then understand maybe what would happen if people did want to jump on electric scooters, and maybe you'd have some of the issues that San Francisco as a city's having. but really the end point is that there's a lot of assumptions we make about our businesses or about our kind of competitive landscape that if you take the opposite, you'd be more surprised in how reasonable those opposites sound. And so using this as a way to gather a bunch of assumptions from the team, say through private ideation, and then taking the ones that you think are most true and taking the opposites of them are actually is a really incredible way to kind of look at that. And I've even done this when it comes to asking people to come up with bad ideas. And the thing that's funny is that you kind of get at this dominant logic in the sense that people think that bad ideas are just the opposite of good ideas. But sometimes, especially when you talk about strategic thinking is not about being worst in class versus best in class. It's about the idea of making a hard choice between two good options. And so a lot of the time, what we would consider bad is really just because of the assumptions we have about the way the world works. The next thing is really kind of proactive, creative, negative thinking. And this is what's referred to as a pre-mortem. This is an HBR article that really outlines it, but it's been referenced before that. But I do these for almost every project that I start. And so it's essentially getting everybody into the same room, having people prompted with the idea that they, in some way, at the end of this project, say 6 months from now, 12 months from now, a year, 2 years from now, they have screwed up this project so horribly that they do not want to work in the industry anymore. Everybody quits. They all go off into the wilderness and never come back, right? Like that's how bad this project just got screwed up. So with that mindset, let's think backwards now. Why did that happen, right? And so once you start to get at these common reasons why projects fail, once you start to understand the crowd and the way that they understand the way that projects fail, you really start to get at the heart of what could go wrong for this project. And so there are definitely some that will be very extreme. right, or very unlikely. But what I find every time I do this process is that the top like 3 to 5 items were things that gave us excess friction or problems while we were running a project, and ends up giving us at least a little bit of forethought before we hit that problem. So yeah, so that's red teaming. And those are some exercises that I've used to really think about red teaming. The next thing is really around this idea of feedback loops. And feedback loops are something that we all talk about. We all talk about the idea of how do we get better at understanding the way that we are in comparison, we actually are in comparison to the way that we think. And there's a particular aspect from artificial intelligence that has been, I guess, been very interesting to me, and has made me think a lot about how do we do this better as product people. And it's generative adversarial nets or networks, which are often referred to as GANs within the machine learning community. But it's something that came out a couple years ago. Ian Goodfellow is really the main researcher, but there's definitely a lot of people that have been involved. But it's this idea, and getting a little bit technical for a second, it's about this idea that there's actually 2 machine learning algorithms that are going against each other. There's one, which is the generator in the blue in the bottom left. And so the job of the generator is to create some type of, say, fake image. And in this case, it's trying to create fake images of digits. And then there's a training set of what we consider to be the world truth. And then the other machine learning algorithm is called a discriminator. And that discriminator is trying to, based on some random selection of a fake image that's generated by the generator or a training set truth image, it's trying to decide whether it's real or fake. And the thing that's really interesting about this is that as you start to train the generator and the discriminator, you get 2 machine learning algorithms that do things really well. So one, a discriminator is basically a classifier for what's real or what's not, right? And that's very helpful in some cases for, say, fraud detection, things like that. But then the fake image, the generator part, starts to get really, really good at creating what looks like real information. And so in this case, if I were to show you this set of 6 photos, you would think that these are maybe stars that you just don't know about. But they were actually generated by a generator of a GAN, a more recent one. And so they're starting to get better and better at actually just creating what it thinks a human being that is famous would look like when photographed. And so the reason why that this works so well is actually the fact that there are really, really tight feedback loops. And that as you keep on going epoch or after generation and generation of kind of testing, both sides are trying to do a better job against that. So you can really think of this almost as like 2 boxers sparring with each other, right? Like you would never pit someone that's very advanced at boxing with someone that's less advanced at boxing and have the more advanced person go full bore, because they would just get destroyed. And so what you're trying to always do, and this happens in chess with ELO ratings, this happens in matchmaking software when it comes to like online gaming, you're trying to find people that you don't know how well they'll actually do against each other, kind of like a discriminator would. And then you're trying to pit them against each other when it comes to getting better at what they're doing, ideally. And so, I have a couple rules or thoughts on what makes feedback really good. And one of them is that it's very personalized, right? Like when we talk about having feedback, say through a one-on-one or through mentorship programs, having it personalized for the actual way that the person thinks or the struggles that they have as an individual is really important. And that's very much related to context and situation, in the sense that certain types of tactics may work against certain adversaries, but may not work against others. And so how do you understand where you are in a process? How do you understand what is the actual end goal of this process this time, which could change, is very important. The fact that it's timely is always good. The idea of, say, saving up feedback for an employee for a year and then giving it to them as a big chunk is not as helpful as small steering adjustments. And I think we can all say that's the same thing when it comes to product management within a team as well, is that kind of big bang releases, things like that don't work as well. And then it needs to be actionable. So the reason why we have feedback and the reason why we have dashboards, the reason why we have metrics, the reason why we do any of this stuff is because we now need to do something different in the future than what we were doing before. And so if feedback is not in some way converted into action, it's basically useless feedback. And so how do we accept feedback? So this is something that I think is probably very core to the way people understand feedback personally. So what I'm wanted to be very upfront with was I've gotten a lot of feedback on the writing that I've done. And so some of that has been pretty assaulting, right? So could do with more imagination, inspiration. Apparently I'm very pedantic and swear more than I need to occasionally. I'm all substance, no style. And then even for one topic that was trying to bridge the gap between technology people and designers or product people, please stop using hyped up topics like AI just as advertisements. So, you could imagine that when I first received any one of these pieces of feedback, I was upset in some way, right? I was not happy. It made me question why I was writing what I was writing. But the reason why is that is actually really good feedback. If it doesn't hurt, it's not good, right? And so this comes from a Medium poster that was talking a lot about feedback more recently, and it really struck a chord for me, not just emotionally, but from the standpoint of like, if we're just being told all the time that we're doing good, right? That can be helpful. That can give us confidence in some way, but it's not actually telling us what's bad. It's not having us question the assumptions. Again, that word assumptions is really key here about the way that our world works. And so this book was recommended to me by someone who used to work for me and someone I mentee named Adam Thomas. And so thanks for the feedback. I think is a really great book about this. There's a lot of things that they go into in this book about feedback. And part of it is about how do you give good feedback and how do you structure feedback, things like that. But the bulk of the book, and I think really the most important parts of the book, are really how do you accept feedback? Because there's no way that you can assume everybody in the world that is going to give you some type of feedback has actually read this book, or that they're willing to play by the rules by which good feedback actually is given. So because of that, what that means is that you need to prepare yourself for receiving feedback in a way that may not always be helpful or happy or whatever. And so the way that they think about it is really feedback triggers. And so while receiving feedback, there's 3 types of triggers that they talk about that will cause you to feel upset in some way, will cause you to ignore the feedback, will cause you to maybe even lash back out at the person that's giving you feedback. And so one of those triggers is really relationship triggers. So, either I have a belief about the way that the way that the feedback giver and I actually work together, and that could be positive or negative, and that in some way it's calling into question the way that the relationship is. And so being able to understand that better, will allow people to maybe not jump on and pile on bad relationships with feedback as much. The next thing is really around identity triggers. So how does this feedback really call into question everything I believe about myself? So that's why things that are very impactful feedback usually makes us question whether we're doing the right thing most of the time and whether we're actually going after what we believe we're going after. And sorry, I skipped one there. The last one is really truth triggers. So what is it about what we consider to be truth of the world, again, assumptions about the world, that is now being called into question? And what's most important about all these things is that we're taking a moment to just allow us to accept that feedback in some way, allow these triggers to happen and for them to pass, right? So it's not about, and probably the most key thing about this, thanks for the feedback book, is that it's more about the idea that you're accepting feedback, you're getting clarification, especially things like truth triggers. You're getting clarification in why the person believes that about the world, in difference to what yours is. And then it's your turn to then go, thank them, go off and think about the feedback itself, and whether you even want to accept that feedback, which is the last part that you're more than allowed to do. And so within product, there's 2 main ways that I think about adding feedback loops. And so one that I think is super important. I think this gets back to when we ask what the KPIs of a real product person is it's not so much how are they tying themselves to success metrics of the product itself. I mean, I think it's important that the entire team are tied to success metrics, right? But what you should be doing is you should be having one-on-ones with your team, people that you're not managing, but people that are just on your team. And it doesn't have to be a huge amount of time. It doesn't have to be, a very in-depth set of questions, but you want to get at do they understand what they're doing, why they're doing it? How does their work tie to the grand strategy that you're going after? And once I start to have a theory about which of my assumptions are wrong, and a very important task during that meeting is to ask people and prime them for particular feedback. Because I think if you ever go up to someone, you just say, hey, give me feedback, they'll be like, well, I don't know. I mean, they're trying to suss out whether you're hunting for just compliments. There's a lot of kind of mental machinery that tries to spin up how they believe what you're trying to do. And so being much more upfront about saying, like, I've heard from people that I X, and I wanted to get your thoughts. Do you think, what do you think about that? And again, not asking leading questions like, do you think that's bad or good, right? But just, what do you think? And I found that this is really, really effective at getting, especially when you need to triangulate that feedback that tends to be, cause you a lot of pain. Being able to rehash it with someone, you may realize that one, it's not as bad as you think it is. Or that maybe you're missing some context that is maybe not as bad as you think it could be. And so I found this question, especially when you're having kind of like casual conversation with people or having one-on-ones with people, just really saying like, I've heard X, what do you think about that? The next thing is what I'll call product manager critiques. And so I wrote a post about this, but I think it's really important that product people specifically get into more of a mindset that designers and developers have already. And so product manager critiques are really about this idea that, say you're a designer, you would usually have work that you're doing, you would put it up on a wall, people would look at it, consider it, and then they'd ask a lot of questions, right? Like, why did you consider this context? Is it accessible? Like, why did you choose this color, right? Because the truth is the person who's in the work actually knows the most about the work. And so just telling them what you think or telling them what to do is actually not as good a feedback as you could give. Same thing with developers when they do code reviews, right? Code reviews, some of the time will break down to just, I have a preference in how this is architected. But a lot of time it's like, why did you choose to do this way, right? Like, what is the context that I don't have that you have? And I'd say, just as another example of where product critiques really come from is, I think that one of the things that product people maybe do a poor job of is whenever there are things that management will say or executives will say that just doesn't make sense, right? And what you should be using that moment for is to understand, why does that executive have a different context in the world than you do? And so all of those things have really inspired a practice that I've done, which is product manager critique. So this is getting all the product people into a room, ideally on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. You have everybody basically take 5 minutes to talk about an overview of the project, who the audience is for the thing that they want to have critiqued, which, again, for product people, we usually deal in communication, alignment, things like that. So this more often than not tends to be some type of document or a slide deck or even a prototype or just kind of like a model of some type. And so what is that audience expecting to get out of that model? And then where do you need help? And you present the model. And at that moment, I usually time box these things. So it's basically 5 minutes for that product person to just talk about it. And they're not there to sell things. They're not there to do anything other than just provide enough context so that for the next 5 minutes after that, they can sit there and shut up and then just mostly get questions from people, right? And so questions about, did they consider this? Did they try this? What about these things? Or why did you do this? And so definitely the product person should be answering those questions as time goes on. But it's less about them answering and more about them collecting alternate viewpoints or mindsets that are from the other product people. And so I find this is like a really great way for product people to not only give feedback to each other about the particular things they're working, but you start to get exposed to so many other ways that product people think and do things. And that to me is really the currency that product people trade in, right? Is all these mindsets or process or tools. It's really about how, like, when and how you use these tools or processes and when do you not. And so if you can in some way glean some knowledge from other people about that before you actually have to go through it, that's very, very helpful. And so that's feedback loops, right? So feedback loops are really not only for yourself, but for your team. How are you providing ways for people to give kind of very raw and honest feedback, but also feedback that is more helpful from the standpoint of questioning and trying to understand than just assaulting people. But that does mean, though, that if you feel like you are upset in some way about feedback you're getting or questions you're getting, that might be a good point for you to consider what is about that is triggering you, and how can you get past that. The next thing is randomness. And so randomness is something that I really love a lot. And I think in the end, what it really comes down to is that I think that people believe that their choices are a lot more meaningful than they are. And not only that, but that when we are constraining ourselves with these biases, when we're not kind of testing our assumptions constantly, we're really constraining ourselves in the way that we're doing, say, explore versus exploit. And let me talk about that in just a second. So this is another great book, Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. It's a little bit more of a machine learning focused book. But as you can see by the subtitle, The Myth of the Objective, it's really trying to ask the question, when we have a very far-reaching objective, right, is it actually helpful to the discovery process of that objective? And let's take an example that they use in the book, which I feel like is a little bit too much of a straw man sometimes, but I think it illustrates the point. But when people first invented vacuum tubes, say back in the 1800s, and I think that was when it was actually invented, they could never imagine that this would lead to supercomputers at some point. And the reason why was that they were not used for, they were not used for computing when they were first invented. And so, there was no way for them to say, I need some type of processing machine or calculator, and I'm going to do that by hunting for, solutions in the near term. And so another example would be evolution. Evolution is one of these processes that doesn't really have an outcome other than a very loose one of survival. And so from there, could we have ever imagined that a very small bacteria or microorganism could have developed eventually into being human, is a really great question. And so the way that these authors talk about it is the idea of if you're at a lake and you need to get across, but it's foggy, and you can only see a couple steps ahead of you as far as stones, it doesn't make sense necessarily to use a compass, right? Like even if you have a very lofty goal, it doesn't help you to necessarily go towards the objective so much. What does help you to do is to search in a novel way through that solution space. And so one of the things that they did was they created this website where they used basically a genetic algorithm to automatically generate photos. And at first, the photos were really just a bunch of like circles, and it didn't mean anything. But they then included a voting system by humans to basically say which of these photos was more novel than others. And then they would, using genetic algorithms as a method by which you took this algorithm that generated, say, a photo, and then you bred it with other algorithms and then created a new population, and then you'd ask for fitness of those things. And so you did this many, many, many generations, and you started to get things that actually look like a beach or a skull or a butterfly or a person. Now, if someone had tried to go into the system and use the actual algorithms and setting their parameters to get to a human face, it would have taken a very, very long time. And it would have taken a lot of trial and error. And it probably would have taken longer than it did to just develop this based on novelty. And so that's really interesting to me. And the reason why that's interesting to me is that, again, those constraints we have are really about, we think that there's a particular way to get the objective, but if things like dominant logic, assumptions, red teaming has like taught us, right, is that a lot of the time, a little bit of randomness injected into a process actually helps you avoid tells over constraints within certain systems. And this is another good example is around poker players, right? So poker players, one of the biggest issues that they face is other people detecting their bluff. And so one way that people will help avoid detection of bluffs is by using a watch face. And if the second hand is in the upper corner or the upper side or the lower side, they'll either bluff or not. And so this is random enough during the game of poker that if they just follow this, they will look more random than they would have otherwise when they were meaning to bluff, for example. And so, again, I think there's a lot here about randomness. And so within the product world, I think there's a couple.
Before you jump into that next part, we have a question that just came in.
Mhm.
Actually, two questions. First one is from M, I'm going to say. How do you deal with people who are unwilling to receive feedback but are on your team developing products and have been assigned by an area manager? Sounds like there's something very specific.
Well, I mean, I don't mean to be talking about that person, Joe, whoever they are. We'll just, no, I'm just kidding. I think that's a really tough question, because I think we're starting to get into the range of like organizational issues in that case, because I guess the way that we do things at Philosophy and the way that I really believe is that, and actually this is something I discovered through kind of researching more about red teaming, but this idea of red teams is that they need to be very small. And the reason why is that you need to have trust between your team members, and each team member has some type of expertise that they're given or has, and they have a decision-making authority over that expertise. And so what I would ask in response to that question would be something along the lines of, well, is it their decision-making authority to make that decision that you disagree with, right? And if that's the case, then you kind of just need to disagree and commit, as Jeff Bezos would say, right? Like that's the problem with feedback, is that people are allowed to also not take it. Now, it doesn't mean that that person is a good person to work with. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't escalate if you feel like it's an issue. But the truth is that if they're making a decision, the first thing I would try to do is try to understand why they're making that decision, right? The second thing I would try to understand is it their decision to make? And so anyways, those are the things I would try to think about when dealing with that type of situation.
Cool. And the next question, I'm going to go over to Matthew. Matthew?
Sure. So my question is there a good strategy for handling feedback from a leadership figure where both you and others on the team have kind of noticed a trend where the feedback sometimes is a little bit more grounded in pressure from leadership above him rather than reality on the ground, reality of what the engineers are working on, reality of what's achievable or accomplishable?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is the biggest disconnect that happens with that is really around strategy a lot of the time, because you have a strategy at the very top of the executive team that does not find a linkage to the day-to-day activities, right? And I think this gets to maybe agile mindsets, right? Or I guess like lean technically, but it's that the idea that the team that is actually working on things, they have the most context. And so it sounds like there is some issue where, one, feedback is not being accepted back from the teams that are at the line, right? Like that's why like not listening to customer support is usually a bad idea, because they know what everybody's complaining about, right? And so I think that's one of those issues. But the other issue is that probably there's not hard discussions happening about the alignment between high-level strategy and day-to-day action. And it could be your manager that is the break in that link, but it could also just be the managers above don't have a good linkage to below. And so again, I mean, there's no, it's very rarely that people do things for nefarious reasons, right? Generally, we're all stuck in contexts that we have ability to get out of those contexts. But unfortunately, some of the time, the ability to get out of that context is just quitting, right? And so anyways, I think those are some interesting things to think about. Like, is feedback getting from day to day, like people on the line up to those executives in some way? Maybe that's an issue. But the other one could be too, is that they're not realigning strategy based on the reality of the world, right? And that's where, when I reference like John Boyd's OODA loop, right, that orient step is the key aspect of that, is that everybody's wrong in some way about the way they view the world. It's just by how much, and how much can you fix that, right?
And next question comes from Hannah. Let me hand it over to you.
Sure. So I am often in this mindset where I know I have these biases, and I keep questioning them.
We all have them.
But I'm just curious, like, because I end up going down this rabbit hole, and I'm just curious, like, how do you know which biases to question and explore further, and which ones are helpful to keep around?
So you don't know, actually. That's the whole problem with the bias blind spot, is that, and actually maybe this is a good into kind of like the idea of randomness, right? Is that part of what I think is key is that, like, and this gets back to red teaming too, is that like we are caught up in our worldviews, right? And so one of the things that we do, like in getting back to the red teaming recon stuff, is that we do research, right? We talk to customers, we watch them use our products, we go out and like talk to other people, we talk to our teammates, you know what I mean? And so that is the best way, I think, to do it. Or that's one way, right? Like one way is just like, if you're not talking to customers, if you're not doing research, you're not doing that type of stuff, there's no reason for you to question what your assumptions are. Now, the issue is that you will still have biases that make you interpret the data certain ways over others, right? And this concept of, say, data-driven product is mostly BS, I think. And the reason why is that, like, it's not just about quantitative things, because quantitative things still need to be interpreted into human purpose, right? And this is a big issue for machine learning and AI, where it's called like the alignment problem, right? Like if you give a reinforcement learning algorithm something to do, especially like there's been some great examples in like Atari games that they're teaching reinforcement learning things to beat, it will find a bug in the code to cheat to win, right? And so whenever you're, and this gets back to, I forget who exactly said it, but the idea of like, once you measure something, that becomes the way that's the way people start exploiting that measurement, right? So that's why, like, to me, quantitative without qualitative and without strategy, right, without goal and purpose or meaning, ends up being very one-sided. And so that's the problem, is that even when you're quantitative, you can still fall into these biases. Now, the last way I would say that you can try to get out of this, besides just like constantly trying to be aware and open to talking to customers and researching, is randomness. And so the randomness is one of the best ways for you to not get into this hole of like only attacking certain biases versus others. So anyways, I'll talk about that in a second, but I think that's a very interesting way to deal with that.
Cool. So that's all the questions we have right now, but do keep them coming in. You can post them to the productmentor.com/live or go to the YouTube link in the chat. And I'll keep passing them along to Chris. With that said, Chris, back to you.
Great, thank you. So yeah, product randomization. So one of the things that I've done with product randomization is there's this great deck of cards called Oblique Strategies. And they're originally created by Brian Eno, who's been a music producer for a very long time, very interesting person, a designer as well. And he created this deck of cards whenever he was producing a record or helping some musicians put together music. They would hit this kind of like block where they couldn't get past things. And a lot of the reason why was that they were getting caught up in their own heads, right? And so he created this this particular deck of cards with a bunch of things. And they're ways to question the world. They're also just statements sometimes. So they're really weird. Sometimes they're just like courage or, you know, like, but they're things that make more sense, like remove the thing that is most important, right? Or play with different instruments, things like that. And so what I've found, one way to utilize this type of randomness, and so you'll see here that I use a lot of things that come from gaming, because gaming usually applies randomness to things, is that this is what's called a crazy eight. And so a crazy eight is used a lot in design thinking circles to do ideation. And so in this case, I can't remember what the exact crazy eight was. It's something to do with the user interface. And this is my actual horrible writing. So sorry, you guys will be very hard for you to try to figure out what it's saying. But what the process of this is actually that you will take 8 minutes, and that for 1 minute for each frame, you will sketch an idea. And so it's super fast. Usually you want to start with like a how might we of some type. And what I've done to add randomness to this is that generally people come in to the exercise with a problem, like the how might we that we're trying to solve. They'll come in with their mindset and their background and their experience with the problem. And then maybe even like, what was the last interface they used? And I take that and I join it with random oblique strategy cards that I draw per frame, draw from the deck. And then people will have to think about how would they now take whatever their current idea is and reinterpret it through the lens of one of these random cards. And so for this case, you start to get very, very broad ideas, right? And it's very key, I think, especially when you feel like you've hit a block of some type, that you explore. And that's really what the greatness cannot be planned people are talking about, is that sometimes novelty is the way out from, kind of closed thinking. Now, it doesn't mean in any way that you should have, the idea of no constraints whatsoever is really bad. And that's why we tend to constrain on a particular problem we're trying to solve for a particular person. But once you get past that, assuming that it always has to be a particular type of web app, for example, is a bad constraint. So what if you use something different? Like what if it was only text messaging that was allowed? Or what if you had to do it via paper? This is also where one of these frames, usually if I don't have a deck of those cards with me, and you can get apps for this as well, I'll actually have people draw a bad idea as a way to get at maybe rethinking the way the problem is formulated. And we've actually taken this is a picture of some board games that we created where, again, we focused on from a design thinking standpoint, but divergence is really this activity of making very creative ideas or exploring a particular space. And so we created a board game, and this was swag for a particular conference, the Enterprise UX conference that's in San Francisco, not this year, but last year. And we included a dice. It's a board game, essentially, where you're going around, and as you're drawing, that's why the timer is there. As you're drawing, you're considering these different things, like making it more sterile, make it more emotional, emphasize the best part, emphasize the worst part. These are all ways to get us out of these constricted ways that we think. And the other side of the board is actually around convergence and how do you start to whittle away which idea to go with. Another thing that's I've found really helpful is there's this type of card called trigger cards. And so they have a lot of different versions. I'm actually working right now on a set of trigger cards with the creator around artificial intelligence and machine learning. But it's this idea of like, there are a lot of things that you don't consider that, you could consider this a checklist, right? You could consider that this whole deck of cards of say 50 or 60 cards is just a checklist of everything that you should consider. But the problem is that you may overthink things then too. Right? So using these more restricted ways of doing idea generation, and again, I always believe that idea generation should be done through private ideation first and then discussion rather than the other way around. You start to select randomly different things. And I've actually done this with, there's a software called Anki, which is like a flashcard software. And so I've loaded up a deck that has the oblique strategies, has well-known human biases, and then the listing of all known mental models that like Charles Munger cares about. And so by drawing a few of those cards, you start to like consider a lot of really interesting things. Like, am I falling to this human bias, right? Am I considering this mental model that I did not consider? Or am I inspired in some way by oblique strategies? And so anyways, it's a technique is to use this type of card randomization technique. Could be very effective. The next thing is, when we talk about just the concept of how we make decisions as product people, right? Again, I believe that we think, if we have appropriate feedback mechanisms, if we are moving rapidly and iteratively, our decisions actually mean a lot less in the moment that we're making them. And what's more important in some ways is actually just making any decision. And so I do keep a magic 8 ball on my desk, probably more out of satire than anything. But what I have done when working with more junior PMs is if there's some type of issue where they're getting paralysis of being able to make a decision, there's a couple good decisions. I will basically instruct them to do this. I'll say, 1, I want you to create a list of all the options. And usually people fall into this bias that it's one of two things, black and white, right? And so if it's one of those two things, you could flip a coin. But I don't think that's as valuable because there's always multiple options. So the example that I had read somewhere around decision making in this really, really dry textbook was, if you were going to decide to buy a record player or not, right? You could decide to either buy the record player or not, right? That seems like two options, but there's actually more. There is that you could buy this brand new record player, or you could buy a used record player and some records. You could borrow a record player from someone to see if you even like it. You could buy a CD player. Those are all options, depending on what your objective is, right? Or if it's just I want to listen to good music. It could be Spotify. And so what I have them do is I have them try to write out as many ideas as possible, usually up to 6, and then I have them roll a dice. And there are two things that come out of this. One, there's probably some gut feeling that if it wasn't the one that you actually thought was the best decision, that you feel some longing towards it. It's the same thing that when you flip a coin up in the air, your gut tells you what you think is the right decision at that point. But then, going forward and saying, okay, well, let's make this as a decision now, but with the ability to change it later. And I do wonder, like, how many of these decisions, like, especially if we believe that product management is about lots of steering adjustments, then it's thousands of decisions, right? It's not one decision. And so if that's the case, then a little bit of randomness may actually help you explore more. And so that's randomness, right? Like I think randomness helps us get away from a lot of these constraints in a way that even our biases about biases will hold us back sometimes. And so the last thing that I want to talk about is really this idea of what's missing, and that's compassion, right? One of the things that I've found, at least when dealing with adversarial models, and this is very much the case when I'm thinking about competitiveness, is that if you really understand your competitor, I think in Ender's Game, he talks about this, the book, it's fiction, but for him, when he really knows his opponent, he loves them, right? And the reason why is that your opponent in that moment, you understand all of the reasons why they are the way that they are. And I think when we talk about adversarial thinking, we need to be more compassionate, not only towards, we should always be compassionate towards everybody in the world, but we need to be more compassionate, especially to our teams and to ourselves. And so this is, a great quote by Jerry Colonna, who runs a podcast. He was at XVC in New York, and then now runs this podcast where he gets all of his, founders to cry during the podcast. But, genuine acts of compassion and compassionate leadership fosters the ability to withstand forces that cause burnout. Right. And so that is the issue, is that adversarial thinking, and this is something that comes from people that do professional red teaming, is that you get burnt out from it from at a certain point. And so I think what we need to be able to be effective product people is compassion, because if we're constantly questioning everything and everything on the team, we will cause some real issues with ourselves. And so I don't know, that's like a piece of this that I think is always missing. So in closing, there's really 3 ways to remove constraints. And I think there's, plus 1, right? So red teaming, how do you think like an adversary or a competitor? How do you understand other people's points of context? Feedback loops, which is how do you, once, with these assumptions that you maybe have about the world, how do you understand, how do you get feedback about those assumptions? And then randomness, how do you break out of these constraint sets that we have to be able to do it in a way that even is constraining based on biases about biases? And then last, how are we compassionate? And so I have like a piece of homework that I would like everybody to do. And I'd love to hear from you via email or, the product mentor or the product group Slack. But like next time you have to make a decision, try one of these adversarial methods, right? So try to make a decision how your competitor would make it, not why, not what they would make, right? But how they would actually do that process. What would they take into consideration? I want you to consider what a bad decision would be. I want you to consider a random decision, and then I want you to consider what would be the compassionate decision for you, your team, and your customers. And I'll leave you with 2 quotes. So Sun Tzu, is really the original strategist, and so victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win, right? If you can in some way help play out these adversarial situations, you'll do a much better job when you actually meet the competition out in the playing field. And sometimes competition is not actually another entity. Sometimes it's just disinterest, right? People not caring about your product. And then last, my favorite quote, which is by Mike Tyson, is that everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And so, try to get punched in the mouth a few times before you go out and try to execute your plan. And so thank you very much. All of the resources available here. I'll post that on the Slack, and I think we'll get it everywhere else as well. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you to our speaker, Chris. This was an awesome conversation on adversarial models and product and all kinds of things. I think I just ordered some of those cards that you just
Cool. I feel like I should get like some type of finder's fee from them, because they're not cheap cards either. But you can actually, I have it's an app that you can get that's just called Oblique Strategies, and it's free. And it will cycle through them as well. So if you really don't want to spend the $50-something for this, it's a very nice set of cards, by the way, but it's very interesting. So we have them in both the New York and LA offices at Philosophy to use them.
The box looked nice. So
it does. It's very nice.
And as always, and as also Chris mentioned, the presentation will be posted on our SlideShare channel. And also a big thank you for me, Jeremy Horn, the product guy, to everyone else who joined us today in the Product Mentor. And also don't forget, if you're interested in being a product mentor like today's speaker, Chris, to product people of all sorts all around the world, please visit theproductmentor.com and sign up today. And also, if you're looking to fill a new product job with a great product person, visit our very own free for all job board at theproductjobs.com. And with all of that said, thanks everyone, and bye.